I can split your arms! You are huge. That means you have huge arms. I can split!
Bro, are you okay? There are some pairings that are just meant to be. Sunny and Cher, Brittany and Justin, Elon and... Now, whether or not these pairings work out for the long term or just burn bright for the short term is a completely different story. But the candle that burns twice as bright burns twice as fast, you know what I mean? Case in point, id Software and Raven Software. We've talked quite a bit about id Software here during the History series, but while they were steadily working on such blockbusters as Wolfenstein and Doom, they were also quietly cultivating a working relationship with budding studio Raven Software, which was founded in 1990 by brothers Brian and Steven Raffel. Raven released a first-person dungeon crawler in 1992 for the Amiga called Black Crypt, and after positive reception, they decided they needed to get into developing games for the PC market. As Brian tells the story, they put out an ad for a programmer with PC knowledge in the local newspaper to start the process, and it just so happened that John Romero's girlfriend at the time saw the ad and pointed it out to him. In a massive coincidence, id's offices in Madison, Wisconsin were less than a mile away from Raven's office, which was in the basement of a small drywall company. So Romero reached out to the Raffles. The id boys ended up visiting the Raven space, and the two studios hit it off immediately. John Carmack was so impressed with the work that Raven was doing that he offered to let them use a modified version of the Wolfenstein engine that he had been working on as a sort of segue towards finalizing what would become the Doom engine. Raven more than happily accepted the offer and developed a game called Shadowcaster, which was a first-person fantasy game which involved the protagonist shape-shifting into a variety of different creature forms, and thus launched one of the greatest technical collaborations in video gaming history. You see, and this is definitely me getting ahead of myself and the timeline of FPS history for just a moment, for over a decade the names id and Raven were nearly intertwined as two studios that innovated in both technology and gameplay, with id establishing the groundwork and Raven building on those concepts. In the mid to late 90s, even in the early 2000s, if you saw a game with Raven's name on it, then chances are it was a game that was utilizing id tech under the hood. For a while there, it was really hard to see Raven games without thinking of id at the same time. And this is by no means disparaging either studio in saying so, because both studios worked closely together, with Carmack passing on tech knowledge and Romero acting as a producer on some of Raven's games. In 2004, while Doom 3 was readying for release, Raven was simultaneously working on the development of Quake 4 using the same technology. In the early days of Raven's growth, Romero went out of his way to buy the Raven team a refrigerator so that they could have a little extra comfort in their working space, which was, believe it or not, kids, kind of a huge deal for a small studio back then. id and Raven were like two pieces of a puzzle. When I was a kid, I actually thought that Raven was a branch of id Studio just because of how much of id's technology they used, which obviously they weren't. But man, kids, it was really hard to not think of one studio when talking about the other back in the day. And nothing exemplified this more than id and Raven's first true collaboration together. Heretic. After the release of Shadowcaster, id was like, well, shit, that game was really awesome. How about you make another fantasy game, but this time using a modified version of the Doom engine, and we'll publish it for you. Which, you know, I mean, if somebody said, here's money to make a computer game, and by the way, here's access to an upgraded version of the engine of the biggest PC game of all time, well, what do you say to that other than, oh, thank God, please? Initially, Raffel, lead programmer Ben Goki, and the rest of the Raven crew went into the project leaning more towards traditional RPG elements, drawing on Dungeons & Dragons for inspiration, but after presenting these ideas to John Carmack, Carmack replied with, just make it like Doom and add the fantasy flavor. Which is then how we got the design elements for what is considered by many to be basically fantasy Doom. Now, look, kids, I'm not going to front on this either. It's hard to play Heretic and not immediately think, oh yeah, this is Doom with just fantasy stuff. The movement, the controls, the weapon feel, it is very Doom. And it doesn't hurt that Romero was deeply involved in the process of development either. He's credited as producer on the project, and not only delivered a bunch of Intel computers for Raven to work with during the creation of the game, but he took the time to work directly with Raven, instructing the team on how to use id's tools and the Doom engine. Id's DNA is all over this game, but at the same time, simply referring to Heretic as fantasy Doom is utterly dismissive of just how much the game pushes both the technology and the gameplay forward. Some of these enhancements include translucent effects, moving sectors in the environment that would push the player around, such as wind effects and moving water, slippery ice physics, the ability to look up and down, which was fairly limited and actually would distort the player's view depending on how much you pushed it, and the ability to fly, which was a huge breakthrough thought up by programmer Chris Reinhardt. He figured out that by simply moving the horizon line of the game up or down, it would create the illusion of player flight, rather than trying to figure out how to program flying physics for the player character, which Brian Raffel called a big event for Raven and helped create a unique flavor for the game. Another innovation they brought to the table for Heretic, one that has since deeply impacted the history of first-person shooters, was the inventory system. Now, it's hard to imagine any fantasy-style game without some kind of inventory to navigate and work with, but at the time, FPS games were limited to whatever pickups and power-ups that the player found in the environment, activated immediately upon grabbing them. But not so here! Here, our player can find, pick up, and store a variety of power-ups throughout each level and use them whenever they felt was the right moment to do so. Items would even carry over from level to level, but in a limited capacity to prevent the player from cheesing the maps as the difficulty ramped up. Healing items, offensive items, defensive items, and quite possibly the item that served as the forerunner to Quake's quad damage, the Tome of Power. No, not yet. We'll cover that soon. Soon. Rounding out the powerhouse developers who worked on this game was one Kevin Schilder, who composed all the music and sound effects for Heretic. He previously composed the soundtrack for Raven's Black Crypt, and after Heretic would go on to compose all the music for the rest of the Heretic Hexen series, as well as working on the soundtracks and sound design for almost every Raven game that came out after this. I wasn't as familiar with Heretic in my teen years as I was with Hexen, due in part to the fact that a friend of mine owned a copy of the Hexen CD-ROM, and we were both huge soundtrack nerds. I think I've listened to the Hexen soundtrack more times than I've listened to most film soundtracks that I adore, and being able to come back to Heretic and partake of Schilder's earlier work in the series felt like a history lesson all on its own. This soundtrack absolutely rips. This is banger after banger of dark, low to mid-tempo fantasy music, which would be much more at home in a dungeon crawler RPG than a first-person shooter, but it sets up the mood so well and keeps the player on the edge of their seat so much that it just, Oh man, let me just play a couple of my favorite tracks. These are so good! And with that, yes, Heretic is, for better or for worse, a Doom clone through and through, quite possibly the only game that should be referred to as a Doom clone considering just how closely tied the game is to the id Software original. And yet, Heretic brings a lot to the table in terms of technological and gameplay innovation that upon playing through it, clearly and definitively sets it apart from its lineage. When the game first released, I, unfortunately, due to the combination of a low-end PC and a super religious mother,
It's not satanic, Mom! It's called dark fantasy.
I never got to play Hexen in 1994. In fact, I spent a few decades totally bitter towards the fantasy genre in general for some reason. I can't actually place my finger on where this grudge actually began, but it was somewhere in the late 90s, so by the time I actually had hardware decent enough to be able to play this game, I had a chip on my shoulder about the whole notion of swords and sorcery and preferred to stick to the realms of sci-fi and action gaming instead. However, at the beginning of 2020, I made a pact with myself to give fantasy a fair shake once and for all, just to see if I actually hated the genre or if I had just some stupid prejudice towards it. And since the entire world went into lockdown in 2020, it gave me plenty of time to figure this out. This led to me playing a medieval, which was absolutely incredible, and I will be doing a video on that game someday because, my god. And after playing a medieval, I decided to give Heretic the fair shake it finally deserved, and just, wow, kids. Wow, I love Heretic. I fucking love this game so much. Holy fucking shit. Oh man, from top to bottom, start to finish, this game is one of my favorite FPS titles ever. For this video, I'm playing it through GZ Doom with the filtering set to original Doom for a more classic experience. I also turned off mouse look for this one, limiting myself to only being able to look up and down through the keyboard controls, although I never used it. It didn't really seem necessary. And with that, allow me to introduce you kids to one of the biggest badasses in FPS, no, in PC gaming, no, in video gaming history. Opening up the manual of the game, we're treated to a really well-written and deep intro, catching up gamers on the story so far. Seems that a trio of dark sorcerers called the Serpent Riders invaded the 7 realms of this particular fantasy world, offering riches and brokering peace between different factions, all while casting a spell over most of the races that inhabited these planes, all except the elven people, known as the She, who were immune to the Serpent Riders' charms. They had a prophecy that the arrival of the Serpent Riders would signal the beginning of Armageddon as well. Once the 7 realms had come under the control of the Riders, the weakest of the 3, Desperal, was left to lord over them as the other 2 Serpent Riders had bigger business to attend to. Since the She were immune to the glamour cast by the Riders, Desperal ordered the elves to be excommunicated and purged from the realms, pursued by the Riders' minions and slaughtered nearly wholesale. We play as one of the few remaining She, known singularly as the Heretic, planting our feet in the sand for a vicious last stand. From the manual. While the other She hid, their spirit broken, you thirsted for vengeance and rode east into the wilderness in search of Desperal. Now you stand before the city of the damned, its air thick with the stench of rot. Your hate drives you to see these creatures oozing their heart's ichor before you. Beyond these gates, the dead and the creatures of the night writhe in dark corners, their bodies aching for your blood. With luck, some of your people's ancient artifacts can be found hidden among the dark passages beyond. For with only a staff as your weapon, the world is surely damned. Fucking badass! Later on in the Heretic series, our main character will be given a proper name because fucking, I don't know, fantasy story reasons. But I'll just be referring to him as the Heretic because that's how he was known in good old 1994, and honestly, it's just a fucking amazing name. Opening up the game, we're treated to an intro screen that goes harder than it has any right to, followed by some brief credits. Sharp eyes notice our id boys in the credits down here. Starting a new game provides us with the option to load up one of 5 episodes, but it's worth noting right here and now that only the first 3 episodes were what gamers got as a part of the original version of the game. Episodes 4 and 5 were provided with the retail version of the game that was shipped in 1996, which was released with a brand new subtitle, Shadow of the Serpent Riders. Once the retail version hit shelves, the original mail-order version of Heretic was discontinued, so if you go out and buy a digital copy of Heretic on Steam or GOG, Shadow of the Serpent Riders is what you'll be getting. I'll cover those details as well as episodes 4 and 5 in a separate section of the video, so for now we're going to explore the City of the Damned, Hell's Maw, and the Dome of Desperal. The difficulty selection. Wow. You know, you could say whatever you want about this being a Doom clone, but Raven knew exactly what they were doing and what players were expecting from this game. I try to play every game on this channel and for this series on the equivalent of ultra-violence, in this case being Thou Art a Smitemeister. The highest difficulty, Black Plague Possesses Thee, is pretty much the same as Smitemeister, except that enemies move 300% faster, enemy projectiles are 300% faster, cheat codes are entirely disabled, but on the plus side, you get 50% more ammo per ammo pickup. So, it's not like it's unfair or anything. Honestly, and I don't know if this is because I've just been playing so many of these classic FPS titles lately, but playing through Smitemeister felt kind of a lot easier than I was expecting it to be. Like, for real, Ultraviolence in Doom, for example, is, despite, not being nightmare levels, it's still a legitimately tough time wrangling your way through the hordes of hell, and yet, somehow, despite the pedigree of this series and the notable difficulty spike in later entries of the franchise, Heretic's initial 3 episodes are surprisingly kind of tame by comparison. The real challenge doesn't drop in until episodes 4 and 5, which is... like I said, that is gonna get its own section of the video. So, that being said, walking into this, having played all the games in the Heretic Hexen lineup in the past, I did walk in with a certain expectation of resistance, so I set myself up with a soft rule for this playthrough. I only allowed myself to save once, at the beginning of each map, and I had to run each mission without dying. I set this as a soft rule because I didn't want to force myself into a frustrating situation where I'm just tearing my hair out instead of playing the game and analyzing it, but all of that considered, I really only broke that rule once or twice because I had something come up in the middle of a level that I couldn't ignore. Like the premiere of the new Indiana Jones trailer. Holy shit, did you see that? I ran through each map, saving at the opening and completing each one in one go, with one exception. But now, maybe it was utilizing this method or just me walking in knowing I was in for a tough time, but playing in the mindset of one save per map hit really differently. Half of my playthrough of this game is really hazy because I think I was in a bit of a focused fugue state. Like, I can vaguely recall details of my playthrough if you put the footage in front of me, which is what I do when I write my scripts to give myself a reminder of gameplay mechanics and level design. But holy shit, I was zeroed in, focused, dedicated, experimenting with weapon combinations and power-up usage. Speaking of which, from the outset, the biggest mark of this game, lending towards it being labeled a Doom clone, is absolutely the weapon selection. Each weapon in the game, save for one, has an analogy in the Rip and Tear original. The Elven Wand, which has a crystal set atop it, functions basically as the Doom pistol, whereas the Heretic will flip the wand over to melee monsters with the butt of the staff, taking the place of the fists. The wand itself is both slightly underpowered, but also highly underrated. Wand starting a map might seem intimidating, but it is a hit-scan weapon with precise accuracy at any distance if you fire slowly. And on top of that, it can even take out later game enemies without too much effort if you have the patience. And considering you'll be constantly picking up ammo for the wand, and more than likely be at max ammo for it at any given time, it makes it a great substitute for whenever you're running low on other weapons. The ethereal crossbow functions as the shotgun of the game, and also slots in as the workhorse weapon in almost every situation. Let me tell you, the fucking crossbow absolutely goddamn fucks. What sets it apart is the fact that, rather than acting as a hit scan like its counterpart, the crossbow fires 3 projectiles at once, 1 larger energy burst and 2 smaller arrows that fly alongside it, which means that the closer ranged attacks will see all 3 projectiles land for massive damage, while shots from further away could see each shot hit a different target. And sometimes the large energy burst will cause knockback damage and send enemies either flinging backwards or to either side, which is another great reason to keep this weapon up front all the time as much as possible. Pretty quickly within the first map of the game, we're also introduced to the gauntlets of the Necromancer. Holy fuck. Why was I so down on fantasy for so fucking long? Some of the names they come up with this shit is truly fucking awesome. The gauntlets are going to act as our chainsaw analogy. They're going to take up slot 1 on the number keys alongside the melee staff, so you'll have to tap 1 to swap between them. Although, once you have the gauntlets, there's really few reasons why you'd want to use the staff. I mean, there's 1 or 2, but I'll get into that. The gauntlets emit a deadly green energy and draw you towards close enemies like a magnet and will shred through them like wet paper. Stronger enemies will still be able to attack you while you're using the gauntlets though, so consider your options wisely when using them. Next is the Dragon Claw, a kind of lightning energy blasting chain gun equivalent with hit scan attacks, and yes, it does sound kind of annoying in rapid fire, but at the same time, I didn't really mind it so much because I generally was only holding it down continuously because I was in the fucking weeds and needed to blast my way out of the shitter. It's slightly less accurate and does less damage per shot than the crossbow, but it fires a hell of a lot faster, which makes it great for crowd control. Plus, when fired in short bursts, it can still do fair accuracy from a distance. My personal favorite weapon of the game, even compared to the crossbow, is the Hell Staff. The fucking Hell Staff. Here's your plasma gun equivalent, blasting rapid-fire red energy projectiles from the fucking horn skull on the end of it. Seriously, this weapon is your get-out-of-jail-free card in most instances. If you're literally surrounded, or boxed in, or have a line of enemies in a row that are bearing down hard on you, whip out the Hell Staff and hold down fire. It shoots fast, it hits hard, it will destroy most every enemy in the game faster than I can read this sentence, and is absolutely necessary for getting through some of the late-game encounters. The biggest downside is that, despite having a high max ammo count, it will unload faster than I can read this sentence. So be wise and keep your eye on the counter, or else you'll run out before you know it. The Phoenix Rod is kind of like the rocket launcher, except it doesn't fire nearly as quickly, although it does a shit ton more damage. Probably a weapon that packs more punch than usefulness. The projectiles travel so slowly that it's possible for enemies to move out of the projectile path before it even lands. This isn't something to utilize on lower tier single enemies unless you're in a desperate situation. Otherwise, stick to firing it on large monsters and tightly packed groups. And the final weapon, the Fire Mace, is well, it shoots fast. Let's put it that way. This is probably the most confusing weapon in the entire game, and while after some experimentation I did eventually find some uses for it, it somehow simultaneously felt more powerful than I gave it credit for, and also felt like it was disappointingly underpowered. It shoots these weird exploding mace balls, which somehow work even though it seriously doesn't feel like they do. I don't know, kids, the Fire Mace feels extra disappointing considering that the other weapons are all such fucking bangers, with exceptional aesthetic values to boot. You'll be key swapping between weapons as situations go from controllable to chaotic, circle strafing and backpedaling, completely sucked into exceptional combat with weapons that provide fantastic feedback and have different situational pros and cons. But for the Fire Mace to be the highest weapon slot and to feel just kind of meh is, well, it's a little bit of a letdown. Still, a good arsenal is only as good as the Rogues Gallery we're going to be using them on, which Heretic absolutely provides in fucking spades. From the lowest tier enemies to the highest tier mini-bosses, Heretic's monsters are not to be taken lightly. Almost every creature has a ranged attack, most travel in packs, and the levels usually carry well over 100 enemies for your blasphemous hands to do combat with. The first episode of the game introduces the lion's share of the minions who populate the darkest areas of this realm. Gargoyles will hover about and flit towards the Heretic to dive in close for melee, but there are also fire gargoyles who have slow-moving fireballs that they toss from a distance and are just slightly tougher. Golems come in two flavors, the regular and the nitro golems, both of which look exactly the same until the nitro golem glows yellow and emits a screaming yellow skull blast that homes in on you unless you turn a tight corner, kind of like a spiritual predecessor to Quake's Vor. Sometimes, though, the golems will appear as translucent ghosts who can't be damaged by melee or physical attacks, only magical, making them extra dangerous, especially in darker areas where they're harder to see. Undead warriors meander about, usually in pairs or in threes, primarily throwing green glowing axes towards the player, but they're also sometimes mixing it up with a red variant that is slightly more powerful. Undead warriors are the only other enemies that have a ghost form like the golems, except the undead warrior ghosts will only throw the red axes. This then brings us to the Disciples of Despairel, essentially cloaked dark sorcerers who, just like every other fucking enemy in this game, travel in pairs or in threes. Aside from the gargoyles, they are the only other flying enemy in the game, hovering about through their magics, speaking in backwards tongues, fading in and out of reality as they charge their magic attacks, which is a spread of 3 purple fireballs. Disciples appear heavily throughout the entirety of the game, much like every enemy introduced thus far, but the Disciples are a special brand of hell. Their attacks hit really hard, and considering the 3-point spread of their projectiles, if more than one of them is launching attacks at you at a time, you'll be hard-pressed to find cover or zip between them without taking loads of damage. Rounding out the enemies introduced in Episode 1 is the Iron Lich, which is introduced in the final map of Episode 1, which was the first map to give me trouble on my 1 save per map rule. Iron Liches are basically massive gray skulls protected by a heavy helmet. They'll shoot walls of flame, they'll shoot balls of energy that do splash damage damage wherever they land. But worst of all, and most importantly of all, they have a tornado attack that will attempt to seek out the player. If it lands, then it will send the Heretic spiraling up and down and side to side where we're in the dark fantasy version of Twister, taking constant damage as it does so. This is easily one of the most frustrating and devastating attacks in the game to have to deal with, and the Iron Liches usually come in pairs or in threes. You kids starting to sense a pattern here? Once we're through the first episode, Iron Liches slowly but surely become less of a mini-boss character and begin to inhabit maps as regular enemies, still possessing just as many hit points and doing as much damage as they do when we first met them. And to give you kids an idea of some of the bullet hell bullshit you're gonna have to put up with in this game, have some gameplay footage of that final map from episode 1. I think it took me either 3 or 4 attempts to run this map without dying. I did it, but it was sweaty as hell. Episode 2 drops a couple new enemies on us, the Saberclaws and the Were-Dragons, both of which look more intimidating than they really are, simply because they are the 2 fastest moving enemies in the game. Were-Dragons have only ranged attacks, belching fireballs at the player for a decent chunk of damage, while the Saberclaws have only melee attacks, getting in as close as possible, as fast as possible, to swing at the player with the blade emerging from one of their arms. On one hand, yes, between the 2 of them, they are the fastest moving enemies in the game, but they're also absolute pushovers, especially the Saberclaws. Interestingly, the Were-Dragons become less and less prominent as you go through later episodes. It's almost like Raven understood that these enemies were best used sparingly as distractions rather than as true obstacles. Saberclaws, on that note, can even be taken out just from using the melee staff. If you're fighting them one-on-one, the slight knockback from the staff will push the Saberclaw out of melee range, so 85% of the time it'll start swinging at you, but just as it gets close enough, your staff will knock it backwards and you won't even get hit. Depending on the angle, of course, but otherwise it's a pretty reliable strat and it humiliates the fuckers to boot. Of course, on the other side of the spectrum, the final mission of episode 2 introduces us to what will become the single biggest threat to the Heretic in the entirety of the game, the Molitar. No, not yet. Not yet. The Molitar is essentially a massive bull creature that carries a giant warhammer for up close and personal melee attacks, if you're fucking stupid enough to get that close, like I am. And they have 2 ranged attacks, a spread of fireballs or a wave of fire that travels along the ground. While in theory they're both easy enough to dodge, the fire wave is the one to watch out for the most, because it not only will do massive amounts of damage, but also has a wide radius of effect, and it seems to linger for a moment in the area it travels through. Getting hit by the fire wave can and will result in the Heretic dying almost instantly, so keep a close eye out for that. Molotars are deadly, destructive, and damage sponges. They have only 500 less hit points than the final boss of the game, and while most of the time, traversing the maps of the game will only see you running into one Molitar at a time, they're introduced to the player in a group of 3. Anytime more than one Molitar appears in front of you, that is a cause for concern, caution, and cover. Do not fucking underestimate the Molotars. Episode 3 only introduces one new enemy type to the game, but it's a doozy. The Ophidian, a serpent-like creature that carries a forked staff that shoots 2 kinds of fireballs. Their projectiles travel really fast, and they're super spongy. They're also constantly meandering back and forth, so trying to land a dedicated line of sight with the Phoenix Rod, for example, can be really tough from afar. Okay, so you kids are probably asking yourself why I've spent so much goddamn time focusing on weapons and enemy types in this game, especially since I don't really stop and talk about these kinds of particulars in very much detail. Well, it's so that when I show you sequences of bullshit like... you get a better understanding of the way that Heretic's enemy variety and weapon balance makes for a constantly engaging, thoroughly stressful, and also utterly impressive power fantasy. No pun intended. Constantly weapon swapping to situationally appropriate items in your arsenal, generally sticking with the crossbow because it hits the hardest, but also switching to the dragon claw for crowd control or the hell staff because, holy fuck, there's too many enemies too close to you, shit. But every single weapon is so fucking impressive and wonderful to wield that whenever you pick it up again for the first time in a new episode, it is thoroughly empowering. Hell, the Heretic will laugh whenever he does so. The D&D inspiration that Raven initially wanted to follow still does feel like it shines through here with the weapon loadout. Rather than, say, Doom, where the arsenal feels more like a checklist of ballistics, Heretic's weapons feel more akin to leveling up each time you find one. The empowering sensation of gaining a new, more potent character ability versus simply strapping on another bigger gun to your back. Man, finding that crossbow for the first time in each episode, it felt like...
Oh, yeah.
And yet, there's still another wrinkle in the big brain strats here, because, you're already constantly juggling which enemies are in front of you and which weapon will work best for the situation. But as mentioned earlier, one of the unique things that Heretics brings to the table, which had a massive impact on the history of first-person shooters, is the ability to carry items within an inventory, and to select and use them whenever you want. Now, there are a lot of items, so I'm just going to kind of cover some of the more important ones and not have us sitting here nerding out about this stuff literally all day. Some items are lying around the maps for instant use, such as crystal vials for health, the silver shield and enchanted shields for armor, as well as ammo pickups. Consumable items you can pick up and store include the quartz flask, which provides a significantly higher health boost over the crystal vial pickups, the ring of invincibility, which temporarily makes the Heretic immune to damage, the shadow sphere, which makes the Heretic difficult to see and makes it so some physical projectiles will pass right through him, the wings of wrath, which provides the ingenious flight capability, and the morph ovum, which, well, it's a magic egg that will turn enemies into chickens. Throw the ovum, which tosses out a few eggs in a spread, and anything caught in its path will immediately transform and become much, much easier to kill. Now, most of these items are incredibly beneficial, but the one that sticks out the most, the one that's instantly associated with the Heretic and Hexen series. Oh, alright. It's the motherfucking Tome of Power.
Ain't got shit on me!
The Tome of Power is 100% a tide turner in this game. Utilizing one transforms whichever weapon you're currently using into an overpowered chaos beast with different effects for each one. For example, the Dragon Claw fires a massive burst of energy which will then split off into something like 8 spiked balls that fly outward in a radius from wherever it lands. The Hell Staff blasts a large projectile which does a hefty dose of damage, but also summons a red cloud of energy rain that does damage over time to whichever poor soul that walks beneath it. This is particularly handy on groups or large enemies like the Iron Liches, but not the Molotars, because they apparently have like a 50 to 80% resistance to that specific attack, which I didn't know during my playthrough, which is why you'll probably see me using that a lot here. But the best one, the fucking absolute alpha sigma one of them all, is the Gauntlets. Not only does it hyperpower the Gauntlet's damage output, but it also causes the Gauntlet to drain the health of any enemy struck by it and feeds the HP right back into the Heretic's health bar. So depending on the situation you find yourself in, you could activate the tome, put on the gauntlets, and go to fucking town and end up with full health afterwards. At one point, I was tired of attempting to nimbly dodge the unwanted advances of a Molitar, so I activated the tome and tried an experiment. Turns out you can absolutely humiliate the Molitar with just the gauntlets and one tome of power. I mean, it does kind of take a while, the entire length of time that a tome will last, but there is something fucking satisfying about standing your ground in front of a Molitar while it bashes you with its warhammer over and over, and your health just keeps on piling back up until it eventually falls over into a bloody pile of bull beef. Smell what I'm cooking, bitch? Now, of course, seeing as how you don't have any limitation as to how many items you can carry in your inventory, nor how many of each one you can stack, it does kind of make sense a little bit that Raven nerfed this aspect of the game just a hair. No matter how you roll the dice, you'll only be able to carry over one of each item from one map to the next. So if you somehow found 3 tomes of power in, say, E2M5, and you didn't use any of them, once you load it into E2M6, your inventory count will be automatically reduced to only 1 tome that you're carrying, which is actually kind of cool because in a subliminal way, it encourages you to make sure that you're actually using these items you're picking up rather than hoard them. Knowing this going in, I felt empowered to experiment more with different item combinations, to actually try and use that damn morph ovum more often. And I absolutely had a shit ton more tome of power rampages than I did the first time I played this game. Anytime you have an extra of any item, use it. And that way, you won't feel any FOMO for anything that you didn't use. It should be noted, however, that the only inventory item that doesn't carry over between levels at all are the wings. Because if you could start the next level with the wings in your pocket, you could probably just use them and sequence break your way through every map, and, well, that just wouldn't be sporting of you, now would it? Heretic excels at quite a few things from a gameplay and technical standpoint, but it absolutely revels in providing an invigorating power fantasy experience that, dare I say it, even outclasses Doom. Sure, Doom is the OG. We would not be where we are without Doom, and so there is always such deep reverence and respect for the alpha prime of rip and tear action, but Doom's action is much more nuanced, more geared towards wading knee-deep through the dead, focused more on surviving the mission ahead, clawing your way out of hell and towards safety. Heretic, though. Heretic falls in line with dungeon-crawling arcade masterpieces like Gauntlet and Golden Axe, where you're constantly picking up power-ups, carving a path across a screen through hordes of enemies who, if you're not careful, can and will overwhelm you. But Jesus fucking Christ! The sense of progression that comes from collecting weapons and having that extra boost of power and damage feels like you're a one-man wrecking ball stomping his way across the 7 realms, a pissed-off elf on a blood mission of revenge, kicking ass and chewing jerky? Whatever the medieval equivalent of gum would be. But you're all out of it, and even though you're staring at a dozen monsters on screen, screaming and flailing and throwing fireballs your way, you're just cackling to yourself as you circle strafe and invalidate everything in your line of sight. Now, don't get me wrong, this game certainly isn't easy. It is really not. There are multiple maps in the game that had me gritting my teeth and sweating and wishing I hadn't picked up this goddamn game in the first place. But this is the natural consequence to mostly feeling like a blood-soaked warrior on a mission from God, because you will feel more deadly and dangerous than in any other FPS we have covered in this series so far. So yeah, obviously we've got some fun player agency, epic confrontations, exhilarating power fantasy, which, when we boil that all down, should mean that Heretic is nothing but non-stop meat-cleaving action from start to finish. Well, you might want to hold on to that thought for a moment, kids, because the combat mechanics aren't the only highlight of this experience, meaning we should go and explore. Now, your dad is certainly no fan of secret hunting. If you've been around on the channel for a bit, you'll notice that I bring that up in almost every single video I've made. But there is something seductive and intriguing about the way Heretic carefully and methodically builds its environments in such a way as to slowly reveal their secrets and open themselves up through thorough exploration. Just like your mom. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of map design, can we take a second to appreciate the aesthetics of this game? Just fucking holy shit. Heretic literally drips with immersion. Now, you've been staring at the graphics this entire time, and while you can tell that this is abso-fucking-lutely gorgeous, a Doom engine title, much in the same way you can tell when a modern retro shooter has been built with GZ Doom, holy shit, this is a gorgeous Doom engine title. The detail put into the environments, from rusted iron bars to stained glass windows to tiled walls, flashing lights and ancient stone. Raven clearly took all of their previous art talents that so impressed Carmack and Romero and went to town with Heretic. Castles, courtyards, cathedrals, craters, even an underwater domed city comprised the lion's share of Heretic's environments. And although they overall can look a little samey, the way they're utilized and designed and filled with monsters and secrets prevents them from feeling stale in any way, shape, or form. Far from it. There's a deft cleverness to the wealth of exploration we'll be dealing with, probably owed again to the Dungeons & Dragons inspiration, with secret walls and trigger plates and hidden switches tucked behind corners. The visuals are also super fucking clean, vibrant, colorful, detailed, enemies are easily recognized even at the furthest distance. Every single one of these character designs is instantly iconic and recognizable. Even though I fucking hate fighting the Disciples of Despair, I also fucking love their design. The black robe with the red and gold trim, complemented by the glowing purple aura around their hands right before they attack, the little gold trident symbol on their chest, which is the sign of the Serpent Riders. This is dark fantasy design at its absolute fucking best. Look, kids, I think one of my biggest peeves with certain aspects of fantasy is the fact that a lot of it looks really bland and similar. Dark clothes, dark armor, grimy hair, it's like, there's nothing really wrong with muted colors and tones and the stereotypical idea of what medieval clothing and fashion looked like. After all, I think historically, you actually had to be kind of fucking rich to afford clothing dyed with any kind of color. But there's nothing like seeing fantasy infused with colors that pop, that stand out, that are as vibrant as the ones we see in this game. Like, take a medieval as another wonderful example. It exudes dark fantasy vibes out the wazoo, but it's also an artful, aesthetically driven, masterfully presented game that doesn't sacrifice seriousness just from using bright colors. Man, I really have to make a video on that one. Part of me really wants to see Heretic get remade, you know what I mean? Imagine some modern tech, or Raven working with the current Doom Eternal id Tech engine, and then either remaking or just making a new Heretic. The color, the detail, the gameplay. Ugh. One of the few problems with that ever happening, however, is that id Software, and by extension Bethesda, and by extension Microsoft, owns the publishing rights to Heretic, as well as Hexen and Hexen 2, but not Heretic 2. Meanwhile, Raven, and by extension Activision, owns the IP rights to all the Heretic and Hexen games, and they also own the publishing rights to Heretic 2. Currently, the first 3 games in the franchise are purchasable on Steam and GOG, with the lone outcast being Heretic 2. For some fucking reason, Activision hasn't listed Heretic 2 on any digital venue, meaning that if you want a copy, you're gonna have to track one down the old-fashioned way. Activision probably doesn't want to put it out on the market because then that could lead to Bethesda making money from the sales of the other games. Money which Activision wouldn't see because they don't have those publishing rights. This is all purely speculation, mind you, but I wouldn't put it past Activision to be that petty. Although with Microsoft lobbying hard to purchase Activision, if it happened, that could lead to Bethesda and Activision getting along again, since everyone is in the same house, and we could experience a Heretic Hexen revival. I know that monopolies are bad and evil and all of that, but if it means getting more Heretic, then I guess in this case it wouldn't be that bad. Maybe I need to rethink my stance on monopolies. Don't you ever fucking say that again. Oh god, I'm sorry. Trying to list all the various tricks and traps that the game tries to play would be a fool's errand and would make this video far longer than it needs to be. But rest assured that while you're running the gauntlet of this game, it will be running you ragged with dead ends, crusher rooms, hot lava. Fucking hot lava in these boomer shooters and having to run across it. You know what? I am so glad we don't really do that anymore. The devs at Raven must have been cackling to themselves with each unique piece of bullshit they devised for the individual maps and the overall tone of each episode. To give you an idea of how much bullshit they throw at you, in E1M6, the cathedral, there's an area you can get to fairly easily with what appears to be an altar. There's no way to progress further than the altar room, and if you turn around and go back through the door you used to enter it, you'll discover that there's no way back up to the platform you dropped from to progress forward. Now, there is a series of stained glass windows circling the area, one of which is actually a door that will lead you backwards to the main area of the map, but still offers no answer as to how to get through the altar room and into the space beyond. Well, it turns out there's a secret door right beside the altar that you need to wall hump for, and you'll be able to progress. This, in the grand sense of the game, is minor shit. This is baby shit, but it's also kind of baseline for the kind of bullshit hoops the game expects you to jump through. Of course, you do have an auto map just like in Doom, and hitting tab will bring that up at any point to help give you an idea of where hidden doors and areas might be. An item you'll be able to pick up for help with this is the map scroll, which fills in your auto map so you can see every hidden nook and cranny. And get used to the idea of checking your map for possible secret doors and hidden locales, because this is I realize I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit here again. This is what we will be nearly exclusively dealing with when we get to Hexen. It's always a little amusing to me whenever Heretic flashes the message, "A secret has been revealed," and it's really just a required room for me to explore in order to get through the actual fucking map. Like, come on, this isn't a secret, this is just the way to go. At the same time, it is kind of a nice feeling to get that recognition and pat on the back, like, good job, bud, you did it. You found another secret. Well done. Here's a Tome of Power. Go see a Star War. These maps are devious, tricky, frustrating, but never at any point did I feel like their labyrinthine designs were ever unfair. Even in my most desperate moments of trying to discern where to go, it always felt like there was a clear solution if only I was dedicated enough to traveling the paths the devs wanted me to take. In fact, most pathfinding solutions involve hidden triggers that open doors, or move walls, or reveal switches once you've explored a specific area of the level itself, which then organically loops the player back and around places that they have already seen, and they now recognize as being different since their return. Other visual clues involve items on raised platforms that are just out of reach, meaning you'll have to find a button to lower that platform, and narrow open spaces between walls to give the Heretic a peek through to the other side where necessary keys or more enemies await. By rights, I shouldn't love the fact that playing through the game is essentially one big secret hunt, but god damn it, there is something so natural and fluid to the way that Raven goes about constructing these areas, which, again, we will see more of with Hexen once we get there. It's just a joy. A joy if you're into this kind of thing, that is. If you're looking for more of a stand-up fight, well, you still get that in spades. But taking cues from their dungeon crawler pedigree, Raven fills Heretic with demand for exploration that yields rewards. Meanwhile, mixed in with those secrets and tricks and traps are plenty of fucking monster closets. The number of times I would pick up an item or flip a switch and then half a dozen disciples or 4 iron liches would pop out was just ambushes. Dear fucking Christ, does this game love its ambushes. There are some genuine pants-shitting moments of brief terror when you realize just how many enemies are surrounding you at times here, and all at the drop of a hat. But I mean, depending on what's coming at you and what kind of inventory you've got, I would say that maybe only a third of the time I panicked a little bit. And the other 2/3, well, for example, here's a moment where the game thought it was clever by locking me into a room full of were-dragons.
In here with you. You're locked in here with me.
That fucking sensation of power. Becoming a fucking godlike warrior with devastating skills and weapons. This game is so fucking good. Okay, so now that we know what to expect from both combat and exploration, really what's left to dive into is the overall arc of the game's plot, which is basically the same setup and execution as Doom. The Heretic travels through 3 different areas throughout the course of the game. Episode 1 is the City of the Damned, which is pretty much assumed to be what remains one of the dilapidated elven towns that the Serpent Riders decimated. Episode 2 is Hell's Maw, the location of the realm where Desparal rules from. And Episode 3 is the Dome of Desparal, an underwater domed city that constitutes Desparal's actual fortress. The action itself is pretty straightforward, or as straightforward as we're going to get with all these twists and turns and hidden hallways and secret doors. Explore the environment, kill everything in sight, move on to the next map. On an interesting / funny note, without really looking at the footage of the game, in my head, a lot of these levels just kind of seem to run together. I could certainly pick out examples of great design or wonderful dick moves if I think about it, but I think one of the downsides to the game is that there is such a constant flow of death and mayhem and secret hunting that sometimes focusing on retaining everything happening in the level can be kind of difficult. Now, I freely admit that sometimes I am not the most observant dad. I'm not, I know. I'm sorry for forgetting to put Nutella on your sandwiches and I'm always using peanut butter. You need protein though. So part of this complaint could be mine, but I don't think it is 100%. And don't mistake this comment as me saying the game is poorly designed at all. Oh no, no fucking way. The map design, the mechanics. This is early Raven discovering the sweet spot and only getting better and better at it from here onwards. Raven has never been anything less than good designers, oftentimes great to legendary, but I've never played a game of theirs that I would consider bad. And in particular, they understand how to implement RPG mechanics even when there are no strictly RPG mechanics in sight. As mentioned before, the gathering of weapons throughout each new episode is indeed akin to leveling up your character and garnering new, more deadly abilities. The exploration throughout the levels, utilizing the map for navigation, all of this is expertly done. In fact, if you'll allow your dad to be a little blasphemous, I think that it even does all of this better than Doom does. But at the same time, due to the often frantic pace of staying alive and the sometimes dead air of trying to figure out exactly where the fuck that hidden wall is, the game itself only suffers in the slightest from the player rollicking through a map and then on to the next one without really being able to absorb the finer details of the work presented, which at the end of the day isn't really the worst thing a game can do. After all, a retro shooter like this usually clocks in around 6 hours or so. After my Smite Meister playthrough that I did for this video, which lasted a little over 10 hours, I'm actually probably going to go back and do a Black Plague run just for shits and giggles. But every journey has an end, and so too does Heretic. What an end it is. It's not quite as intimidating as facing multiple Iron Liches or multiple Molotars, but certainly a sweaty boss fight nonetheless. After rampaging through Desperal's defenses, the Heretic comes up against the titular Serpent Rider himself. First off, I want to note the spectacular geometry and the use of moving textures on the walls of this opening area, which fucking blew me away the first time I saw it and still hypnotizes me now. There's some similar work in previous levels, but it just seems to stand out more here. It's so fucking good. But once we finally make our way outside, Desperal is waiting for us, riding his serpent just like we were promised he would be. For those interested in canon and lore, this is a Chaos Serpent, and it is not the last time we will see one of these. I'm trying so fucking hard to not just jump ahead to Hexen, you have no idea. But the boss fight has essentially two forms. First off, we have to battle Desperal on top of the serpent, but then given enough damage, the serpent will collapse in a heap, leaving Desperal to fend for himself. Here he teleports around the arena whenever he receives enough damage from one of the Heretic's attacks, emerging from a teleport base that is scattered around the map, sometimes summoning in disciples to aid him in combat. Now the thing here is that you don't want to ignore the disciples, because Desperal will keep summoning them over time, meaning you could potentially have 8 or so disciples on your ass while you're trying to figure out where Desperal teleported to. And that's the kind of bullet hell we like to avoid in this house. Anyways, do your due diligence. Desperal will eventually fall and crumble into bones.
Nice touch.
And you, the heroic Heretic, are free to triumphantly return to your home, your people freed, the realm saved. Or, are you? Yeah, as the final flavor text informs us, even though the creatures of this plane under Desperal's control are now dead and gone, that doesn't mean everything is peachy keen in the wake of our battle. No, because there are still the other 2 Serpent Riders out there, teased in a mysterious little cutscene after the flavor text. But also we're informed that Desperal seemed to have let loose a curse on the Heretic with his dying breath. A curse that, canonically, causes some really awful times for our favorite Serpent Slayer. As the Heretic steps into a portal to escape the destruction of Desperal's dome, what he doesn't expect is that the curse is activating, with the portal not taking him back to his realm of reality, but instead somewhere worse, which means that it's time to explore. On March 22nd, 1996, nearly a year and a half after the original release of Heretic and close to 6 months after the release of Hexen, Heretic got a retail re-release, which added in 2 additional episodes to the base game's 3. The 2 new episodes were titled The Ossuary, which saw the Heretic exploring the remains of a desiccated world that had been destroyed by the Serpent Riders ages ago, and The Stagnant Domain, which is Desperal's birthplace and current home to his former generals and bodyguards. Once this retail release went wide, Raven ceased updating and selling the previous shareware version and continued forward with this one, and that's why purchasing Heretic on Steam or anywhere else includes the subtitle Shadow of the Serpent Riders. So, picking up story-wise where Vanilla Heretic ended, it turns out that the curse Desperal uttered with his dying breath means that the Heretic is doomed to wander the outer realms of his world without a way to find himself back to his home. And here, with these 2 episodes, we learn the Heretic's fate and whether or not he can survive this curse. These 2 episodes are just fucking nasty. From point 1, Shadow of the Serpent Riders throws both the player and the Heretic into the fucking lion's den. Hell, E4M1 has a goddamn Molotar in it right off the goddamn bat. I mean, I am talking about absolute mayhem. Playing through the entirety of this version of the game from the base chapters and into the shadow chapters, there is such a fucking turning of the screw that it is almost as though Raven understood that the initial build of Heretic was a little easier than perhaps they wanted. After all, by this time, Hexen was out into the world, a game which is far meaner and much more vicious than Vanilla Heretic is. So with that context, it's easy to see just what Raven had learned from the construction of Hexen and then turned to apply it to Heretic. Shadow of the Serpent Riders is, in every sense, Raven's version of Thy Flesh Consumed, and for the most part, these 2 episodes are fucking brilliant. Somewhere, somehow, some way along the line, Raven figured out how to take everything that was great about Vanilla Heretic and distill it into an intensely brutal experience that will test the resolve of even the best Heretic players. Now, up until this point, I had stuck with my soft rule of only saving at the beginning of the map. Episode 1 had only given me trouble on the final map. Episode 2 was a 100% deathless run, thank you very much. And Episode 3 had definitely been a little nasty in the opening mission, having to wand start against some serious odds against me. Oh, and yeah, I did die once while fighting Desperal. But Episodes 4 and 5... E4M1 took me over half an hour to finally figure out how to run through it, just for starters. And every mission after that through the whole of episode 4 was lengthy, sweaty, cautious runs of me desperately moving and dodging every incoming fireball, trying to find ways to create infighting as distractions, constantly running low on ammunition because the number of creatures in each map seemingly has doubled. And while episode 4 was tough, a touch sloggy, episode 4 is the only episode in the whole of the game that feels like it kind of drags near the end, like it's just tough for tough's sake, I still managed to maintain my soft rule of saving intact throughout. And then I hit episode 5. And, let's examine some footage of E5M1, shall we? An hour and a half's worth of attempts. An hour and a fucking half. This map is infamously devious. Infamous. And while I'm sure it's doable to hit the whole damn thing on one deathless run, one starting on Smite Meister is really fucking difficult. It was here that I abandoned the one save rule. It was the only thing I could think of to save my own sanity and push forward. This is the first fucking level of episode 5, and it is an absolute gauntlet of unceasing pain and punishment. So of course, I resorted to quick saves in order to get myself through the mayhem and the murder, and was finally able to find my way through to the end. And after that, I thought that maybe I would be okay for the rest of the episode, that I would just break the one save rule for that one map. But no, I gave up on that pretty damn fast, and I started quick saving left and right for my own sanity, because this, episode 5, is the apex of Heretic's design. brutally difficult and punishing as hell, demanding that you pay attention to and utilize every single item and weapon and pickup you can get your heretical hands on, constantly conjuring new and more sinister methods of environmental anguish for you to deal with. One map involves swirling currents that push and pull you in different ways as you navigate around, demanding your attention as you have to rush against the current and then suddenly find yourself pushed in a completely different direction. Monster closets, hidden doors, iron liches, and molotovs left and right. In the end of episode 4, the final boss fight is a group of 11 iron liches in a close quarters ambush that really nearly got the best of me. But the final fight of episode 5? 7 fucking molotovs, which honestly sounds a lot scarier than it really is, because you're given plenty of room to run around, wings for flying, invincibility rings, so it's really just a matter of time and staying out of the path of their flame walls. Still, despite not being as difficult as, say, Disparal, the final boss fight of the game is demanding enough to feel worthy of the end of this massively difficult update to the base game, and it caps off a brutally intense episode with a final bit of power fantasy as you yank and split these motherfuckers to the goddamn death. Coming back to the game for the first time, there were a number of maps that I remembered as being incredibly tough and difficult to navigate, but my slightly hazy memory remembered these moments as being earlier in the game. Nope. Me walking into this playthrough and thinking that the game was ridiculously difficult was because the final third of the experience was what stuck out in my head the most. Yes, the first 3 episodes of Heretic are, for the most part, a lot easier than basically the other FPS titles we've covered for 1994. Vanilla Heretic is slickly designed, very well executed, and a thrill ride from start to finish that keeps the blood pumping and the power fantasy high. But Shadow of the Serpent Riders sees Raven return to the 7 realms of Heretic with a vengeance, demanding high expectations of the player, putting them through the ringer much the same way that they did with Hexen, and would crank up even further with Death Kings of the Dark Citadel. And as a whole package, the full experience, start to front from episode 1 to episode 5, it is a sinister, devious, action-packed thrill ride that encompasses and embodies the desire and drive for Raven to create a game that built on the ideas of Dungeons and Dragons, of the hero's journey, of taking a character from humble beginnings to exquisitely powerful heights. Taken as a whole, some players might find it strange that the central villain of the story dies at the midway point. I mean, really, in modern media, who fucking does that? But the choice to continue the story past Disparal's demise, to have the Heretic wander across the realms as a lone outsider, cursed to combat the machinations of the Serpent Riders for basically eternity? Well, that is the kind of bleak storytelling that only dark fantasy can pull off, and here it pulls it off extraordinarily well. I am a big fan of games that take the original experience and escalate the difficulty to give seasoned players something that requires their utmost attention and dedication to the game mechanics. Both Heretic and Hexen do this in spades, with the kind of expertise that made Raven a development house to be reckoned with in the 90s and 2000s. But brutal difficulty spikes alone are not nearly enough to justify the existence of bonus content, which, while I did state previously I had no intention of reviewing expansion packs or bonus content for any of these games, Shadow of the Serpent Riders is an update to the base game, which is now the only way to purchase said game. And since it wasn't sold as a separate expansion pack, I'm counting it as a part of the game itself. It's also helpful to show the escalation of difficulty as a way of illuminating part of the history of both the FPS genre and the history of this series. Anyways, difficulty spikes alone don't justify bonus content. Well-designed content does. Man, boy oh boy is this shit really well designed. Outside of 1 or 2 maps in episode 4, feeling like they just kind of were there to keep the player working hard, the whole of the 2 new episodes are fiendish in their construction and mechanics. Coming out of all of the lessons Raven learned while making Hexen, I certainly hope that they would be. They're smart, they're clever, they keep the player working for their goals. And what's most important about them, especially in light of how difficult they are, they're never unfair. Mean, yes. Unfair, never. And they absolutely perfect what was already an excellent game experience. And as such, despite the base game being a little easier than expected, and the 4th episode dragging just a little bit, Heretic, Shadow of the Serpent Riders is an excellent, impressive, and absolutely iconic entry into the history of FPS, worthy of far more than the Fantasy Doom moniker many gave it at launch, and I'm going to give this game a 9.5 out of 10. And holy shit, kids, we just finished covering the most significant FPS titles of 1994. This was an interesting year for the evolution of first-person shooters. From System Shock to Doom 2 to Marathon to Rise of the Triad, and now here with Heretic, we can clearly see the arc of progression from the humble beginnings of the genre that Wolfenstein 3D pioneered. Engine updates, the presence of inventory items, the introduction of narrative elements within the game itself as opposed to just snippets of story told in game manuals, the leaps and bounds that developers took to push both FPS gaming and computer gaming as a whole forward is absolutely mind-boggling. Of course, we have to remind ourselves that even though there were landmark games that came out of this year in gaming, there were still a whole bunch of other titles that really lived up to the moniker Doom clone. There were 21 FPS games released in 1994. Games like Depth Dwellers, Corridor 7, Operation Body Count, Super 3D Noah's Ark, Blakestone Planet Strike, The Fortress of Dr. Radiaki, and, Red Babe? Seriously, a first-person shooter called Red Babe. What the fuck is this? Hold on. The game features the player's quest to save the beautiful Charla, the titular Red Babe, because of her penchant for a red dress. Future versions were to become a 30-plus level intricate 3D experience and an adult fantasy type with nudity? Wow, okay. So 1994 still had some growing to do. But this has been a hell of a year for boomer shooters, and each one we've covered has been a truly unique and innovative title that, even when I was frustrated with them, really, truly resonated with me. I'm sincerely looking forward to diving into what 1995 has to offer, even though I'm also a little bit nervous about it as well. Some of these titles might need a little more technological fiddling with to get them to work with modern technology. Not my favorite aspect of working on this history series, but an important one for the preservation of gaming history. I do want to say really quick, thank you so much, kids, for having a little extra patience while I worked on getting this video out the door. There were a number of life circumstances that reared their ugly heads right at the beginning of December, just as I was hoping to be able to get the production of this video into high gear, which is why it took me a whole lot longer to make this than I wanted to. Again, I just really want to say thank you for hanging out while I slowly chipped away at this one, and I'm truly grateful for you for sticking around to the end. And with that, I'd like to say, happy holidays, kids! 2022 was a rough year for many, and as we turn the corner into 2023, I hope you all find the strength and the energy to remember to be kind to one another, to be kind to yourselves, to remember to stay hydrated, to sit up straight every now and again and take a little strain off of your back. I'll be taking a short break in January to clean house and get some new material under production, but I'll still be streaming on the weekends in the meanwhile as I do so. So have a happy new year, kids. Stay safe out there. I'll see you next time. I'll see you next year.